Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's book talk. My name is Gary Chen. I am the Public Relations and Development Manager for the libraries. I also host these outreach programs. Tonight, we have an interesting book talk by Christine Lowe. And she is the Chief Development Strategist at the Institute for the Environment and Division of Environment and Sustainability at one of our sister institutions, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Tonight's book, Underground Front, the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong, written by Ms. Christine Lowe, will be moderated by Professor Fu Hualin from our Faculty of Law here at Hong Kong U. So to get right into it, I'd like to introduce Professor Fu and to start and introduce Christine. Thank you.
Thank you. Few would doubt the contribution of the Communist Party for making China what it is now. And no one would really deny the importance or significance of the Communist Party in the governance of Hong Kong, especially for the period to arrive. You cannot really understand China, cannot understand Hong Kong without a proper understanding of the Communist Party. As the saying goes, the parties in the south, in the north, in the east, in the west, and the Chinese way of put it is also in the middle. So the party is everywhere. Unfortunately, the party is not a well understood institution. Sort of like the Holy Spirit. You feel the existence, you cannot really reduce it to a physical form. Fortunately, we have Christine here today, who has the knowledge, the foresight to looking at that institution far before we realize its real significance. She has a very exciting career. I think Christian doesn't really need introduction, but let me just use that opportunity to say a few words. We've been working together on an NGO. I always want to introduce her to the audience. Now I have the opportunities. She was trained as a lawyer, studied law both in the UK and in Hong Kong. She was a business person in her early career. And before anybody else went to Beijing, he was really in Beijing for many years doing trade. Then she became a lawmaker, first appointed and then elected to the office. In 2000, she created the NGO called Civic Exchange, best known for its cutting-edge research and its independence. It offered a prototype of what a think tank in Hong Kong could look like. From 2012 to 2017, she was Undersecretary for Environment in the government. After leaving government, she started to teach in UST and also UCLA. Her enduring contribution include ending gender discrimination in the new territory in a particular way, allowing daughters to inherit properties. That I thought is a tremendous contribution to the Hong Kong society. Of course, she's also the key lawmakers in the promulgation of the protection of harbor ordinance. Our harbor could be much smaller than it is. without Christine's helping hands. Most of us are dreamers. We wonder about wonderful things to do, but then very happily return to our office to continue things as they were. Christine is someone who put thoughts into action. She has the courage to explore opportunities that life offers to all of us, and she excels on everything she touches. She acts, therefore she thinks. It's an honor and a privilege to her thoughts on the party and its relevance to Hong Kong's governance. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. I'd start to talk about the book as to why someone like me would write such a book. I'm not a party insider. I'm not someone who is actually very familiar with the party. And I've titled my talk today as Writing as Learning. I'm interested in the party, and one way to learn a lot about it is actually to write about it. I was inspired to start this research project some years ago. I think I started the book in around 2008. I finished it in 2009. Did a tremendous amount of reading, and writing is an exact demand. I was able to learn a lot. So what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit about my interest, and I've structured my introduction today in 3 parts. The first part is why I'm interested. Secondly is a little bit about the structure of the book. I mean, I am personally fascinated by the story, and the story has a beginning and it ends kind of today. And then I'd like to share some personal observations with you. Well, this is the book. I'm very privileged to have a second edition. The first edition came out in 2010, and then a Chinese translation came out shortly after that. Maybe you can think back when there were defining moments that captured your imagination about some aspect that is related to the Communist Party. For me, it was the 1966, 1967 riots. I was a very little girl, but something was going on. Excuse me. And my mother used to work in a building in Central, and I would often go and see her on Saturday. And one Saturday afternoon, she took me to the canteen of this company she was working for. And as I looked out of the window, I saw something drop from the other side of the street, and it was a bomb. And then the bomb went off. It was not a very powerful bomb, but you can imagine a little girl looking out of the window, seeing something black drop, and then there was this tremendous blast. That left a very big impression on me as to what was going on. In talking to my parents, they didn't say very much about it, but it was the first time I was asked, what if my parents were to leave Hong Kong? But actually, quite soon after that, I said, of course, I would go wherever they were going to go, but they didn't talk about it anymore after a while, and we continued to stay in Hong Kong. What happened relating to the riots and the bomb, I think over the kind of months, I have some vague memory of a lot of muttering by family members. But nevertheless, that bomb left a very, very deep impression. Then the second thing was I was a bit older then. I mean, as I said, that period passed. The parents did not talk about leaving Hong Kong anymore. And after a while, I was exported to boarding school in England. And in 1972, I watched a documentary by a very well-known journalist at the time called John Gittings. This is Denny Gittings' father, and some of you may know Denny Gittings. And that is the book that accompanied this documentary. And I was completely mesmerized by the documentary. The documentary, it was released in 1972, so this is in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. And it was the first time I saw an extensive, long presentation about mainland China, about the People's Republic. And what I saw there was so completely different from the society, the Chinese society that I'm familiar with in Hong Kong. And I was very, very taken by the images that I saw. And you can imagine that in 1972, the kind of images that were shown, Tiananmen Square, the Cultural Revolution, and so on. The documentary was made by BBC as part of the big news that Richard Nixon was going to go to China. So again, the memory of Richard Nixon going to China and the talk around that time, I was a teenager at the time, a young teenager, again, that was a very momentous moment. Something was happening. Something was happening in a place called China. I'm Chinese, I kind of couldn't quite connect to it. The images that I saw was not of a Chinese society that I understood, but I took a great interest. Then I went to university and I studied law, and at the time, in the 1970s, reading Marxism was still a little bit popular, and I have to admit, I was very taken by the writings of Karl Marx, and the notion of his thinking and Marxism, it sort of left an impression on my mind. Not that I did anything. It was really just what a student would do when you're just absorbing lots of things when you're studying. Then, surprise, surprise, after I graduated from law school, I came back to Hong Kong, and it was the experience of the Nixon visit some years ago that China was so different, and because I was studying law, I had this brilliant idea at the time that I should perhaps focus on a specialty. I should focus on Chinese law. Because you will remember that in the late 70s, after the death of Mao Zedong, there was talk about China opening up. And this was the reform period, and obviously they were going to require law. They were going to have to bring law back. And I thought at the time that perhaps I could specialize in Chinese law. Well, it was a brilliant idea. I came back to Hong Kong because my parents were here, and I thought I had to actually brush up my Chinese. How can you study Chinese law if your Chinese is very crappy, like mine was? So I enrolled actually for a year in the Chinese university to study Mandarin. And they have a course, it could be as intensive as you liked, and I signed up for many hours every day to study Chinese. And I was going to go back to England to start a job at a law firm in 1980. But surprise, surprise, I ran into an old neighbor of my parents, a gentleman that I had not seen for a very long time. And this gentleman worked for an American company, and it was the first, I didn't know any of this at the time, but his company, this American company, was the first company to get a license to open a representative office in Beijing. And so this was at the very, this was, I think, in the final month of 1979, and he couldn't find anyone to go to Beijing. And he asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm learning Chinese here, and I'm going to go back to London. He says, oh, you know how to speak Mandarin? And I said very badly, but yeah, And he said, would you consider going to Beijing? He said, we have this offers, I'll put you up in a... He was throwing money at me. He was just saying, look, we really need somebody that... So I went. So I said, okay, I'll go. He says, just go for 6 months, see how it is. And their business is commodities trading. I couldn't smell commodities at the time. Right? I mean, I really had no idea what it was, but for me, it was the exciting chance to go to Beijing. So I showed up on the 2nd of January 1980. I walked around Beijing. I mean, I just thought I was in heaven. This was like the most tremendous experience that I could have at the time. The flip side was there were other people in Beijing who thought it was a really hardship post. People didn't want to go to China at the time. It was very difficult for these foreign companies to find people to go to China. They couldn't find people from Hong Kong. They wanted somebody who could speak Mandarin. I mean, they would even take me, I think because my Mandarin was not so good, but I was wildly enthusiastic. So anyway, I had a tremendous time there. So my first encounter with the Communist Party was in January 1980 in Beijing. Now, it was a fascinating time for me because I was working for this American company, trading commodities, and even though I didn't know how to do any of the business, I was like Chun Sing Tong, I was the coordinator. They would send me messages to say, go and talk to such and such an import-export company and try and buy and sell, metals and whatnot. So anyway, so that was what I did. And I would show up at business meetings, and I'd be on my own. And the first 2 months, there would always be 3 people who would show up at the meeting. There were 2 who were negotiators, and then 1 was the party man. And it was very interesting because the party man would always speak first. And the party man would only stay for about 10 minutes, and it was to give the proper view about ideology or whatever. And then he would leave, and then we would sit down, and then we would start the business discussion. But after about 2 months, the party person didn't show up anymore. And in talking to my commodities counterparts, they would say, well, there's no need. We can just talk business from now on. So I had a whole string of these kinds of experiences. Talking to people there, I mean, people who were in the import-export business, many of them were party members. And I think I generally just asked very simple questions, like, how do you join the party? What do you do, Just simple questions that were quite fun for me to ask. So as I said, that was my first encounter with the Communist Party. Well, so that was 1980. But what else was happening? I was coming and going between Beijing and Hong Kong. And after about 6 months, the company offered me a long-term assignment, a long-term contract, if I was willing to continue to conduct these business meetings in China, but I could be based out of Hong Kong, so I would need to travel a lot. And at the time, Hong Kong was actually wrapped up in discussion about the future of Hong Kong. So I had one part of me, which was going up to China, finding everything really very interesting and fascinating. Coming back to Hong Kong, joining a group of friends who at the time belonged to this group called the Hong Kong Observers, and we were talking about Hong Kong affairs. And one of the most gripping issues was, well, what's going to happen to the future of Hong Kong? So I was immersed both as somebody doing business in China, and at the same time in Hong Kong, I was engaged with some young people, and we were thinking and talking about the future of Hong Kong. And you can see in this picture here, you can see Maria Tam, who's still a very prominent person, and you see Martin Lee. And because of my interest with this group called the Hong Kong Observers in public affairs in Hong Kong, I was extremely privileged to meet all these people who at the time were already very prominent in Hong Kong society. Well, being a member of the Hong Kong Observers, being an active member, I also had, tremendous opportunities to meet British politicians, because what was going to happen? What was Britain's intention? What were they going to do? And we also had the opportunity to meet some Chinese officials. And what I realized was happening at one time, before Britain and China had an agreement about the future of Hong Kong, was that people like us at the time, sort of younger Hong Kong people who kind of represented the future of Hong Kong, they kind of both wanted us to be on their side. A part of the most familiar part of perhaps the book, Underground Front, has a chapter during that period. And whilst the story is quite well known, there are some parts in it which I kind of went through myself that you may be interested in. And then, of course, in 1992, I never thought that I would be appointed to the Hong Kong Legislative Council. And I believe I was appointed because of my association with the Hong Kong Observers. I thought when Chris Patten, many people ask me, you must know Chris Patten very well. I said, no, I didn't know him at all. Why would he know me, a young politician in Hong Kong? But obviously, what the British wanted was they wanted to appoint some people onto the Legislative Council at the time, and there were 3 appointees, myself, Roger Locke, and Anna Wu. And the commonality between the 3 of us is that we were relatively young, and we had democratic persuasions. So this was obviously the type of person that they were looking for. But I never thought anyone would appoint me to be a member of the Legislative Council. So again, by accepting that appointment, like accepting the job to go to Beijing, I felt that these were periods of time that kind of changed my life completely. If I had not gone to Beijing, if I had not perhaps been so excited about China in 1972 because I saw, this documentary about China, if I didn't think that perhaps China could be a part of my legal career, if I didn't come back to Hong Kong to brush up my Chinese, and then having the chance to have my first job in Beijing, and then accept it, and then getting into politics. These were nothing that I planned in my life. But they happened, and I went for it. Okay, at the same time, I was interested in China. I've always been interested in China. So from the time that I got interested in the 70s, and then my first job in China in 1980, I also felt, as China was reforming, that I kind of went along with it. I was there, I traveled to China often, because I was in the commodities business, and we were in physical commodities. Physical commodities means you actually buy and sell the thing, not just trading on an exchange. So we bought metals, we bought steel, we bought sugar, we traded them. We bought and sell these big tonnages of commodities with China. So I got to go to very far away places, in mines, in petrochemical plants, and I went to all these places that other people wouldn't go to. So I always felt very interested in the transition China was going through in her economic reform. So definitely I considered myself someone interested in just watching and observing China. But because of my political engagements and interest in Hong Kong, I also had a particular seat kind of on the ringside, watching that particular political engagement between the mainland and Hong Kong. So that's the background. That's why I'm interested in the Chinese Communist Party. So as I said, I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to write a second edition to the book. I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the book, but basically the second edition allowed me to do a number of things. One is to make correction to things that I got wrong. The things that I got wrong, some of them were names and dates and what happened. And if you read the preface of the first edition of the book, one of the things that I thought was, well, I'm singularly unqualified to write this book, but somehow nobody else had done it. Nobody else had kind of written at that time, right? By the time the first edition was published in 2010. But since then, actually, a number of books have been written by people who are much better qualified than myself, people I would consider insiders about the Chinese Communist Party and their activities in Hong Kong. So some of them had pointed out that I made some errors here and there. So second edition, I hope I've corrected all the ones that I found had been raised. Secondly was I was able to write the full 20 years of the years after the transition, because the book was published in 2010, the first edition, so that means the book really only went up to 2009, so from 1997 to 2009, you could say that was approximately the first half of the first 20 years, but the second edition allows me to have a look at the full first 20 years. And in writing that, it wasn't possible just to add something on, because I think what you can see in 10 years and what you can see perhaps in 20 years, there's quite a lot of difference. So I've completely rewritten the last chapter. And also, as I said, I've updated a number of the other chapters. So this is how the book is structured. The early years, from 1949, of course, the Communist Party became the governing party in China. The Cultural Revolution years, the early years of the reform, Deng Xiaoping, and of course 1989 is an important year because that was when Britain and China agreed that Hong Kong would go back to China in 1997. And then from then onwards, the party worked on shaping post-colonial Hong Kong. What would Hong Kong be like after 1997? And then, as I said, the last chapter is the post-reunification years. Well, most people ask me about the recent times, but actually, I'm fascinated by the other earlier parts of the history of the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong. In the 1920s, actually the book started just a little bit before the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 in Shanghai. The 1920s was a very exciting period. It was a time of labor movements, it was a time of strikes, it was a time where workers in China really looked to what was happening in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was an inspiration for the mainland in terms of what was happening here with the assertion of labor rights, and you had fantastic stories of how farmers and workers were walking out of Government House and joining protest. So for anyone, I think, interested in that period of history, it is definitely an exciting period. Now, I relied on a number of works, and I do recommend these works because they are very exceptional, and they talk about, you could say, certain particular, they drill down to particular little periods of important history. Two of them are published by Hong Kong New Press, and I believe you can still buy them, so you can have a look at it here. Now then, of course, we come up to the war years. That's also very compelling, and of course one of the big questions in history was, after the war, why didn't they hand Hong Kong back to China? And the context of all of that is actually geopolitics. I mean, I'm not going to go into the details here, but again, that's a fascinating period because Hong Kong, we're a small place, and big forces amongst the major powers they always were circling around Hong Kong. And you could say that maybe today these great forces are circling around Hong Kong again. But this is not what's happening today, is not the first time. And I think tracing the history of Hong Kong, being a British colony and how the British looked at Hong Kong and their attitudes and so on, always very fascinating. And of course also the United States. And then we had a civil war after the Second World War, and then of course in 1949 the Chinese Communist Party became the ruling party in China. So a very compelling history. Another very important part is how the Communist Party looked at Hong Kong. And they looked at Hong Kong, I'd say, in a very, very forward-looking, very pragmatic manner. And it seems like that Zhou Enlai was the architect of much of the policy. Hong Kong policy was both domestic, but it was also foreign policy. And again, that context, I think, has always been very fascinating. So maybe we can just go through a little bit about how the Communist Party looked at its Hong Kong policy, because you can kind of see nuggets of it, nuggets of thinking, carrying it through into the future. So part of the overall strategy of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong policy for the Communist Party, they saw it as part of the East-West struggle. It was not just about whether China wanted to say, well, it's a part of Hong Kong, we should just take it back. They were much more cool and calm and collected in looking at Hong Kong. So their assessment was, with Hong Kong in British hands, this actually gave them a greater lever to get Britain to persuade America, in certain respects, to how the US were going to deal with China. And China used Hong Kong as a staging post, an intelligence center, a communication center, a fundraising center. So Hong Kong was very important to the Chinese Communist Party. It was very convenient to have a place like Hong Kong. Then this phrase of the United Front. The United Front, Hong Kong is a base for them to make friends, to raise money, to meet capitalists, to perhaps also rally young people to the cause of capitalism, to socialism. Now, then I think it's important to then look at the Cultural Revolution. And I have this quote here, which I think it's important to see how the party looks at the Cultural Revolution, because it has an impact on the modern history of Hong Kong. So this comes from a very important Central Committee document in 1981. The theories and practice of the Cultural Revolution were totally erroneous. It did not constitute social progress. It was responsible for the most severe setback and the heaviest losses suffered by the party, the state and the people since the founding of the People's Republic of China. So I think the party has acknowledged that the Cultural Revolution was a big, big, big error. Okay, well, what did it mean for Hong Kong? When we look at 1966 and 1967, the riots were considered to have been initiated by the local leftists. Because, after what happened in Hong Kong, of course, Hong Kong people turned away from China, turned away from the Communist Party. So how, on the mainland, how they themselves had to explain what happened. So one of the chapters talk quite extensively about this, and I do think it's important. But today, the leftists at the time, and many of them are still alive, they felt that they were used because they burst forth on the scene to riot and to support mainland China because they were patriotic. But yet afterwards, they suffered terribly. They became ostracized in society. It was hard for them to find a job. People really didn't want to know them. Then you kind of realize that in 2001, there was a controversy in Hong Kong. Why did the first chief executive award the Grand Bohemia Medal to a man called Yuan Guang, which a lot of people had forgotten about, but a lot of people remember that he was one of the main characters of these riots in Hong Kong during the Cultural Revolution. So the award to him of the Grand Bohemian Medal brought up this whole discussion about Hong Kong's memories about the Cultural Revolution. In the second edition, I was able to add something about how those people who went through this period today, they called themselves the 69 Synergy Group, because 2017 was the 50th anniversary of the Cultural Revolution, they still had a lot of emotions carried from the past. And we can completely understand that. And so they held a moving memorial service at one of the cemeteries to pay tribute to the people who were killed. I did talk to actually one gentleman who was a policeman at the time. And he also worked closely with, you could say, the leftists, subsequently, in more recent years. And both sides had very moving moments talking to each other about what happened then. In a way, you could say that this group of people, the leftists, were forgotten. So I think that we're probably not yet finished with collective thinking about the legacy of the Cultural Revolution. I anticipate that there will be more research, maybe more discussion about this period going forward. Well, now we move to one of the phases that probably many of you are familiar with, the taking back of Hong Kong. And you will remember that Governor McLehose was the one who went to China and tried to suss out what the Chinese intentions were. And certainly we now know that Britain could have or had the desire to perhaps retain Hong Kong if it was possible to find some ways of doing it. But in the end, China decided they would take Hong Kong back. Now, what was interesting about that period was, China and Britain, there was a bit of competition about how they were going to do this. And it was a period of intense united front. Here, on the right, what I've done is I've put down periods of active united front. And the yellow highlights is that during that period, there was intense united front. One is to take Hong Kong back, how to win hearts and minds in Hong Kong, how China was going to. United front just means go and make friends, go and talk to people, persuade people to be on your side. But at the same time, this was also, in the 1980s, the early phase of economic reform. So it was also very important to China to promote modernization, to promote the fact that we should all be very positive and hopeful about China embarking on the modernization path. So there was a dual messages: Hong Kong, the future of China, reform. I think many of you remember the gentleman on the right, Hui Gatun. Hui Gatun was interesting because I'm just going to go forward a little bit, because he left a biography, an autobiography for us. And I still think it is recommended reading. He was a very high-ranking Communist Party member, and in his book, it is possible to read it at many layers to try to understand the party. And I relied on parts of the book extensively. So we go back to that. And the picture on the left is very interesting, because that's part of the United Front. The Communist Party said, well, we are communists. We don't know how to run a capitalist system, And to run the capitalist system, we're going to need the capitalists. So you could see that this line of thinking essentially meant that the capitalists have to be attracted to stay in Hong Kong. They should continue to do business here, continue to invest in Hong Kong. So you see a lot of the capitalists being kind of round up to be part of the future. They were being assured that you will have a future in Hong Kong. That picture showed you many of them, and I think you'd recognize who they are. Many of them are still, of course, their companies are still very active in Hong Kong. Then, of course, we had a surprise. The surprise was Mr. Patten. Mr. Patten was a very different kind of governor. And during that period, because election was going to be something that would be rolled out in Hong Kong, for the Communist Party, it was very important that if Hong Kong's going to have elections, their supporters have to win elections. So this notion of thinking about elections became more and more prominent, both for the party and, of course, for other people in Hong Kong. Then also, there was this notion about convergence. I think you'll all remember that. There was, in fact, no convergence because Mr. Patten had election arrangements that China said, we did not agree to this. And you might remember the 7 letters and so on, extraordinary period. I discuss it, only in passing in my book, because I think there are many books that have gone into great details. But to complete the story, it was essential for me to go through a little bit of that. And then, of course, it was essential before 1997 that we also have a chief executive in place. And so you saw before the transition how this came about. The election of Mr. C.H. Tung as the first chief executive. And then, of course, you actually saw before that, we had the Basic Law Drafting Committee, the Basic Law Consultative Committee, we had the preliminary preparatory committee, we had the preparatory committee, and then eventually, after 1997, we also had the provisional legislature. So I think watching all of these things happening, it is possible today to look back and see how to interpret that story. Now, the last chapter, the last 20 years, I think it's actually possible to divide it up according to the times of the 3 chief executives. And there was something significant about each chief executive. So I would say that for Mr. C.H. Tung, he tried to push through Article 23. He also put in place a ministerial system. I think that's important in the sense that this was a significant change to the governance structure that is still evolving today. And for Mr. Donald Tsang, the second chief executive, he did actually push through an important electoral reform initiative at the time. But he was wrapped up in an unfortunate corruption case, and we know the rest of the sad story. Then the third chief executive was Deng Zhenying, and what did he face? His challenges, one was mass movements. We had several rounds of mass movements, starting with national education. And then LegCo, the level of what I call disorder in LegCo rose to a tremendous extent. In fact, during his time, the functioning of LegCo has changed completely from before. Now, I think then I asked a number of questions. How might the CCP function in Hong Kong post-1997? When I was in LegCo, I asked this question in 1995, and the response was basically deafening silence. But in the book, he actually talked about what it might be like. And that's why I think his book is important, because there are nuggets in it that gives us some perspective. So this is what is in the book. After 1997, the leading organ of the work committee, which is the Communist Party, should exist openly. But the grassroots organizations of the party should continue to play a secret role. Moreover, the work committee should be separate from Sanwa and be renamed. It should be run openly. However, after 1997, it is unreasonable that the CCP will still be an underground party in Hong Kong whose activities are regarded as unlawful. So anyway, he has his idea is quite clear here, and maybe we can look at how it is today. My sense is, it is actually the situation today is quite close to what Hoigati wrote about. Now, the other thing about elections. Elections for the Communist Party is not an end. It is a means to an end. And the means to an end is to elect people who are essentially the majority of are loyalists, are patriots. This is an interesting point of discussion in Hong Kong. I mean, in the West, in liberal democracy, election is an end in itself. I mean, it happens to also create a government, but the belief is the people will elect, and they will elect whom they elect. And if they even elect a government that is not necessarily very competent or very good, nevertheless, this is the people's choice. So election is an end in itself. Whereas I think for the party, the election is a means. It's not an end itself. Now, I do feel that in 2005, we were given an opportunity in Hong Kong to directly elect the chief executive, but this did not happen. It was rejected under much drama on the floor of HKUL, and I think personally that it was a lost opportunity. We should have gone for it. But in any case, of course, once we lost that opportunity, the whole discussion said, can we have it again? And we're not quite sure how this is going to go going into the future. We're still pursuing electoral reform going forward. Now, patriotism. This notion of who's a patriot, what does it mean to be a patriot? I think it's important for us to see in 1984 how Deng Xiaoping defined it. And he said a patriot is one who respects the Chinese nation, sincerely supports the motherland's resumption of sovereignty over Hong Kong, and wishes not to impair Hong Kong's prosperity and stability. Those who meet these requirements are patriots, whether they believe in capitalism or feudalism or even slavery. We don't demand that they be in favor of China's socialist system. And I think he's actually also said on various occasions, you don't have to, you don't have to support the Communist Party. We only ask them to love the motherland and Hong Kong. So that was for a long time the definition of a patriot. Now, this is a more modern version. And it's important to look at this too. So we are ready to talk to anyone, right? We are ready to talk to anyone who loves the country, loves Hong Kong, and genuinely supports the principle of one country, two systems, and the basic law of the Hong Kong SAR, no matter what political views or position he or she may hold. Any attempt to endanger national sovereignty and security, challenge the power of the central government and the authority of the basic law of the Hong Kong SAR, or use Hong Kong to carry out infiltration and sabotage activities against the mainland is an act that crosses the red line. So he's drawn a red line, and it's absolutely impermissible. So finally, just some personal observation. China is a rising nation with huge ambitions. And today we can see China itself has set two important dates in how it wishes to pursue modernization. It's 2035. Basically, China is saying that by then, China should have completed, right, its modernization, and by 2050, it would be a more advanced modern country. we are going through massive geopolitical shift. The shifts are, I mean, we can all feel it. Where it will take us, we're not sure. But we also know Asia, China will be important, will be more important at this time. Autonomy. Of course, what we want in Hong Kong is a high degree of autonomy, but it's autonomy that has to work within the construct of one country. So the definition of one country, how we associate, how we see one country, is very important to how we also continue to enjoy autonomy. One of the personal views that I have is, what is it that Hong Kong has to do to be important in China? I have no doubt that, Hong Kong in China, we're talking about Hong Kong in China, so how can Hong Kong make a mark for itself? I think many things that we've done in Hong Kong, we've tried to do them as well as we can, the professions, the law, and so on. And I think Hong Kong will only be able to continue to have our place, a credible place in the nation and in the world, if we continue to pursue excellence in all fields. And lastly, because we are Hong Kong in China, we want China to do well. So this notion of how can Hong Kong continue to contribute to national betterment in good and bad times. Countries go through cycles. Sometimes times are better, sometimes times are more difficult. But if we are attached to the nation, then, well, how can we continue to contribute to national betterment? So thank you very much. I hope that summarizes some of my thoughts.
Thank you so much for this very much insider's view. You are as insider as anybody could be in the circumstances. Of course, Jatin could offer a more insight views, but then we know what happened to him. So there are many questions. I guess my only comment is, you mentioned that Karl Marx. Of course, the importance of economic infrastructure determines the status positions of a place. Hong Kong used to be 25% of Chinese economy. So back in the early 80s, China only had 4 Hong Kong add together. Now China had about 50. If the Chinese forecast went well, within 20 years, China will have 100 Hong Kong. So that is, in a way, is Hong Kong in China. The question is how we are going to adjust our thinking, our position in this huge economy. So without further ado, I would open the floor for questions. Yes.
Thank you, Christine. Very good. So in the first part of the presentation, you shared prior being appointed to that group, shared a first-hand experience, and then afterwards you jumped outside, analyzed how the CCP's activities in Hong Kong. Do you mind to share a little bit your personal experience when you were working in HKUL, or working in think tank, or working at the government? What was your encounter? How do you work with them, with CCP, when you were in those roles? And the second question, if you don't mind, is how can young people contribute, and how is the way that you contribute to national betterment? Thank you.
Actually, I didn't have to deal with the CCP at all. Perhaps, I don't know what people assume, but when I was in government, when I was the undersecretary, I didn't really talk to anybody on this in terms of the party connecting with me. The conversations that I had were always dealing with counterparts, and because I was in the environment, the people that I dealt with were people in Beijing or people in Guangdong, people in Shanghai. They were sort of immediate counterparts. So our conversation were professional. And there weren't any issues in terms of our conversation. I never had a visit from Zhongyunban. Right? I never had nobody ever knocked on my door and said, you know, come and have tea with me. But this could also be, I mean, frankly, this could also be because I was extraordinarily unimportant, and I recognize that. I'm being serious, I'm being serious. I had one occasion where I was with all the other undersecretaries. We were invited to spend a number of days up in Beijing at the HKUL. And it was a very interesting time because the HKUL, I mean, you know, we were having classes, so we had scholars and people in the military. You know, we talked about how they looked at military risk. We had discussions about the basic law. We had discussion about diplomacy. I mean, they were wide-ranging discussions, and I have to say, they were the kind of discussions that we couldn't otherwise have in Hong Kong. So they were meant to be educational in nature. And that was the only time where there was a bit of more intense discussion with people from the party, you know, the people in the, you could say, in Beijing, whose job was to entertain us. You had a more difficult question, but maybe I can come to this about what young people can do.
Yes, yes, please.
Thank you so much. I just had a question. You have some really interesting sections in your book about the role of the pro-Beijing press in Hong Kong. And I just wanted to ask, I mean, it seems in recent years we've seen the pro-Beijing newspapers playing a much more aggressive role, targeting localists and even foreign critics of the Beijing government. Do you see a shift in the last few years in the kind of role that the pro-Beijing press is playing in Hong Kong, the state-run newspaper? And is it sort of going back to the kind of role that they were playing in the late 60s in Hong Kong?
I mean, personally, I tend to see the press in the bigger context also, and I describe this a little bit in my book about the changing role of the press. So I think you could say that from a matter of policy, China obviously supports a number of media organizations here. I think that's, you know, just part of their policy, long-standing policy. Who are the people who would read the mainland press? I think that's another question you might be asking. I think people read the mainland press because they are interested in analyzing or knowing, understanding how the mainland sees certain issues. Today, if you wanted information and news, there are just so many other channels that you can look at. But we also see in Hong Kong a variety. You could say maybe it's harder to exist, I don't know, right? But in terms of the range of non-establishment news sources, social media and online media and so on, they are also there. But, you know, all I'm saying is, in terms of explicit policies, supporting a number of media organizations, you know, that's standard policy for the party.
But why have they taken on this very aggressive role in recent years, you know, singling out critics and spreading what's essentially very sort of extremely biased narratives, and sometimes completely made-up narratives, even about foreign politicians, like the Malaysian politician who was here quite recently, who was accused of setting up separatist camps in Malaysia. I mean, why are these narratives coming out in state-run newspapers now?
Well, that I can't say. I don't have a great answer for how they deal with these things. I'm just stopping at, actually, that's part of their policy to support a number of media in Hong Kong. How they behave, right, what they write about, and the emphasis at any particular period of time. You know, I'm not going to go into any, and I didn't go into any analysis of that in my book.
Let's see. Actually, I have a lot of questions to ask about your past, present, and future. But to be fair, I'll just concentrate on history, okay? Because you were so involved in the transitional period, so I think it's not unfair that I ask you all the hypothetical questions on, the transition. Now, during the negotiations, the initial negotiations between Britain and China, there was a story that Britain was quite ready to trade sovereignty for administrative control. That means Britain would be happy to remain as the manager, while to use business term, China would be like the major shareholder, whatever, or the sole shareholder. Okay, so that was the story or scenario at that time. But of course, Deng, being what he was, on principle refuses, I won't comment on whether it's right or wrong. But I'm just saying that from your perspective, if this, arrangement was accepted by both parties, hypothetically, would Hong Kong be better off? Of course, there will be no one country, two systems, okay? But just want to put you on the line, on the spot. Do you think Hong Kong would have been better off, with this kind of arrangement for, I don't know, maybe 20 years, 30 years, that will smooth out the transition? My second question, if you don't mind asking, but I'll make it short. Chris Patten, of course, was sent by his party and John Major to Hong Kong to handle this transition. But Chris Patten, being what he was, a very intelligent, highly intelligent, but very aggressive guy, so he took a very high profile against the Chinese, and so there was no deal as a result. So do you think it would have been better if Britain had sent another, more, I would say, flexible, I'm not sure it's the right word, but at least somebody who knows China better, because Chris Patten obviously didn't want to understand China, okay? He wanted to do it the British way, okay? Or the English way, okay? So that resulted in
well, maybe
okay, I'm sorry, yeah.
maybe one way for me to answer that question is the possibility, for example, for Hong Kong to remain British for another 20 years, or maybe we didn't have Chris Patten, it'll be a good fiction to write. If it had happened that way, but as I said, I'm not going to get into kind of really thinking about it, because I think it didn't happen. But it didn't happen. But writing fiction, I think my answer is writing fiction would be fun.
Another question? Okay.
There's a question out there.
Ron, Christine, can you explain why, that's not for you to explain, can you speculate why the Communist Party has a problem for its members to declare that they are Communist Party members? And why the legislation hasn't been changed to make it legal?
I think the party still believes it is not the right time. My own contention, back in 1995, when I raised a legical debate on how the Communist Party would operate after 1997, was that, well, you are the ruling party in China, now that Hong Kong is a part of China, it seems not quite right. But I think the party had always thought that it was such a sensitive issue, and that Hong Kong people have such a sensitivity about the Communist Party that it was better not to talk about it. So there was this huge pretense in Hong Kong that it wasn't there, but everybody knew it was there. So we lived under a kind of fiction about the Communist Party. My personal view is, I think we have come, well, maybe I can go back to Hoigatu, because Hoigatu, the party obviously talked about this before and after 1997, what to do about this. So Hoigatu gave us a glimpse of the kind of conversations that they've had. And what he said was, well, the organs of the party should be there. And you could say, the liaison office is quite clear, it's there. It doesn't call itself the Communist Party, but it's there. But the non-government parts are not going to come out, so to speak, and say they are parts of the Communist Party. So I think that thinking, what that represents, and going forward, I still think the party today is not ready to come out yet. But in many ways, they have already come out. They're very active. The Chinese officials, many of them, if not all of them, are party members. We see them every day. They're very active. They engage in all kinds of activities in Hong Kong, right? They're constantly invited to public events and so on. So they're there. We see them. And perhaps over time, any unease could be more acceptable, and maybe it will still, I still think it'll be many years before the come out of the party will be done fully. I still think we're a long way from that. Perhaps there was a question here about what young people can do. I do think, however they feel about China, each person individually have to reconcile with what they think about Hong Kong being a part of China. So at a certain level, it's a very individual thing. Secondly is they have to ask themselves whether they want to contribute to this country. And there are many aspects of this country that is, I think, very compelling. So for example, just talk a little bit about my own experience in cleaning up the environment. It is obviously important for all of us to do that. And in fact, you could even argue that the bigger picture is if China does not decarbonize and clean up, it's actually bad for the world. So we must all work to see how we can deal with certain issues. And again, for example, in the area of legal training and law and so on, it's, despite the socialist system being very different from the one that we have, having better trained lawyers, working on legal concepts, and so on are very important. And I think we have Professor Fu and other legal scholars in Hong Kong who are very dedicated to doing that, and that must continue because the strengthening of those areas are clearly important for the country as it advances. So I think there are many aspects of things that we can think about national betterment.
You talk about the changes and continuities, say geopolitics. If you look around, the big powers 100 years ago are still around, the same power. Right? China still have the same need. So the question is, what really has changed? More pointedly, are our leaders, all of us, getting dumber than our ancestors? If you look at the early party leaders, they may be brutal as Communist Party leaders. They were, but then somehow, at least on Hong Kong issues, they have vision. Right? You look at our current leaders, they're much older. Zhou Enlai, when he was in charge, he was in his late 30s and early 40s. Look at our current leaders, they were in their 60s, even 70s. They're older, but not necessarily smarter. Is that something that would have a huge impact on Hong Kong policies towards the future?
Well, but there are many younger officials in China, and the ones that I've met are well-educated, very ambitious, and they think in very big ideas. So, okay, there are national leaders. Perhaps the pace of replacement, there's a certain rhythm to it in China. How will the party change? I think, any discomfort that we have relating to the party today is we're not sure whether it's becoming much more conservative rather than opening up. And we feel that if China were to continue to open up, that would be a good thing. We would like China to go down that path. We're uncomfortable because we're not sure whether it is going to do that, or whether we see periods of tightening that this would, generally, I think we see this relatively negatively in Hong Kong. But I do think, politics has its cycles. The kinds of things that are happening around the world today, people would say, even in America before 2016, that it was impossible. Now, of course, they're going down a path that is perhaps more negatively seen. But in China itself, I don't see everything as frozen in place. In fact, China's changing all the time. So what kind, and it's also a very individual thing, how you wish to see the future. I'm one of those people, and I think this is personality, I'm one of those people who would move the deck chair on the Titanic. Because the alternative is what? The alternative is just to sit there. What is it that we need to do to perhaps improve our chances for survival? This is why I'm saying, can we adopt an agenda of excellence? I want to show people in the mainland, I want to show the world, right? Because the world's very competitive today. What is it about Hong Kong that is great? What is it that people will come and knock on our doors and recognize us as excellent? Because I think that's the only way for Hong Kong to survive.
Thank you very much. Just two quick questions, please, if there's time. The first is sort of just from an academic standpoint, just a question on the you writing this book. If you could unpack that experience a bit more, was it quite a straightforward topic to research? Did you encounter any difficulties? Any sort of at any time did it feel like you were stumbling across some uncomfortable truths or anything like that, or was it a relatively straightforward experience? And then the second question, please, if there's time, is to what extent do you think the CCP understands Hong Kong? Obviously, there was a time where it was complete anathema. I was trained in the fully in sort of Marxist, Maoist doctrine, taking over this sort of epitome of the capitalist system. Do they understand it today? Have they been on a journey? What would your take on that be? Thanks very much.
I'll answer the second part first, because there's actually a bit in the book, in the last chapter, that talks about people who are very close to the party in Hong Kong. These are well-known names, and their frustration with Chinese officials perhaps not sufficiently understanding Hong Kong. So I think it's better than me saying, well, I don't think they understand Hong Kong, because when you're writing, I'm not writing a book where I'm just expressing my own perception. And so the technique, in a way, in writing the book is to say, who said what, and under what circumstances did they have this view. So in the book, I refer to a particular quote from Rita Fan, who knows the system very well. And her frustration, and this was a recent frustration, this is something that she said just in the last couple of years, that she felt that they should hire people. What she said was, liaison office should hire people from Hong Kong, and that if they had people in Hong Kong, they would better gauge how Hong Kong people feel. So, so I think there is a large group of people here who really know the system much better, who really feels that somehow, despite all the attention from Beijing to understand Hong Kong, you know, bringing a lot of their officials to Hong Kong, that somehow there is still a gap for us to understand each other and for them to understand Hong Kong. Now, in terms of writing the book, whether there were any difficult periods, the more difficult periods are the more recent periods. Because if you were looking at, I was really looking at other people's research to try and string it together and tell a story. I'm not a historian, and I didn't go particularly into original research in terms of digging out new materials and interpreting it. But when we come to the last 20 years, this is the period where things are still happening. How are you going to write about things that just happened, you know, a couple of years ago? This presents much more of a challenge for me, because again, I'm trying to tell the story, but not overtelling the story, and not having. I want the book to have a certain balance, so the last chapter isn't, you know, so much longer than everything else. So selecting what to touch upon and how long each section is for the last section, I'd say that was the most difficult to do.
All right, if there's no more questions, I do think also the lack of a stronger word, the idiocy coming out of the U.S. is probably giving China a big, nice shot in the arm, punch in the arm and saying we need to rely on more countries and work together with other countries. And I think that's where the prosperity is going. They can get away from America, and that's coming from American. Okay, really appreciate you joining us this evening, and on behalf of the libraries, I'd like to present you with this souvenir, a copy of our Hong Kong Almanac and Directory from 1846. Forgot to bring the paperwork. We have another book talk next week by our School of Journalism and Media Studies by Mr. Bowring, right? And trying to remember the title of the book. But it will be next Tuesday, and registration is on the School of Journalism and Media Studies website, so you can register there. We are just providing a venue during the time, so they will be supporting it and taking on the registration. The book is called, this is really hard for me to say, Austrian Stasians and the Southern Seas. Okay. And the book talk will be next Tuesday, 6:30 to 8 p.m. on the ground floor seminar room. And I know he's been having lots of book talks, and he'll be giving insight on the Empire of the Wing. Sorry, it's a late day. Empire of the Winds, the global role of Asia's great archipelago. So that'll be next Tuesday at the seminar room at 6:30 to 8 p.m. And that really concludes this evening, and thank you for joining us. And I think, Christine, you're going to stay and sign some books? Or? Yes, just a few books back in the corner there. Okay, thank you, and have a good night. Thank you.